It was the spring of 1970, a time when air travel was still considered a glamorous adventure. On one particular afternoon, a commercial aircraft lifted off from New York City, bound for Manchester, England. Its passengers were a blend of businessmen, families, and a handful of young travelers chasing the thrill of Europe. Among them sat a man whose fate would soon diverge from all the others. The sky was calm when they departed, the engines roaring with the promise of crossing the Atlantic. But hours into the journey, things began to unravel. At first it was subtle, a strange vibration that rattled the trays, a faint odor of smoke in the cabin. Passengers whispered nervously, craning their necks toward the windows. Then came the sudden jolt, the kind that makes your stomach lurch as if the earth itself has dropped from beneath you. The captain's voice cracked through the intercom, trying to sound steady, but the tremor in his tone betrayed the truth. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a technical issue. Please remain calm and stay seated." But calm was impossible. The aircraft shuddered violently. Lights flickered and overhead bins burst open, spilling luggage across the aisle. Someone screamed. Children cried. And then came the sound that every passenger dreads, the engines, desperate sputter, followed by silence on one side of the plane. The descent was brutal. The cabin tilted sharply, pressing bodies against the seats. Oxygen masks dropped from above as the plane tore through layers of clouds. What had been a smooth flight only hours ago had become a nightmare in freefall. People gripped their armrests and prayed, some aloud, some silently. The only thing louder than the screams was the deafening roar of wind. As the aircraft lost control, the island appeared out of nowhere, an endless stretch of green and jagged cliffs, rising from the ocean like a beast from the deep. The pilot tried to angle toward the flat stretch of trees, fighting for even a shred of control, but gravity had already claimed the machine. The final moments were chaos, a violent crash of metal against earth, the splintering of wings, the shattering of glass, then silence. When the smoke began to clear, the jungle around the wreckage was eerily quiet, as though the island itself was listening. Out of more than 100 souls, only 2 bodies stirred. One was gravely injured, barely breathing, while the other, shaken, bloodied, but alive, pulled himself from the wreckage. His name was not yet important to the world, but in time, his story would become one of survival, despair, and unimaginable endurance. As the sun set on that first night, the lone survivor sat amid the wreckage, listening to the distant calls of strange animals and the crackling of fire from the torn fuselage. He didn't yet know the nightmare awaiting him, or that this forgotten island, larger than he could ever imagine, would become his prison for the next 723 days. Morning came with a haunting silence, broken only by the crash of waves against distant cliffs and the shrill cries of unseen birds. The wreckage lay scattered like a giant's toys, twisted metal, scorched earth, shattered luggage. Amid that chaos, 2 men remained alive. One of them, a young man in his 30s, had deep cuts across his chest and leg. The other, the one who would one day tell this story, dragged himself out from beneath a crumpled section of the cabin. His body ached with every breath, but the sight of another living soul gave him a surge of hope. He stumbled to the injured man who lay barely conscious, gasping for air. There were no doctors, no supplies beyond what could be scavenged, no comfort but the trembling hands of another survivor. "Hang on," he whispered, though his own voice shook. "We made it. We're still here." For 2 days he tried to keep the man alive. He tore strips of fabric from abandoned clothes to wrap around wounds. He searched the wreckage for water bottles and anything edible, but most of it had burned or been flung too far into the forest. He gave the injured man the last of what little he could find, ignoring his own thirst and hunger. But the island was merciless. By the second night, the man's fever climbed. His breaths came shallow and his eyes flickered with a distant glaze. There were moments when he seemed to drift into dreams, whispering names of loved ones the other could not recognize. And then just before dawn, he slipped quietly into silence. His chest rose one final time, then never again. The survivor sat beside him for hours, numb with grief. It wasn't just the loss of another human being. It was the crushing weight of being truly, utterly alone. He buried the man in the soft earth near the trees, marking the spot with a jagged piece of metal from the wreckage. No prayers, no family, no last words, only the endless sky above and the whisper of wind through the branches. That night, as he sat beside the faint glow of smoldering debris, the reality sank in. He was marooned on an island no map had prepared him for. No planes passed overhead. No radio crackled with hope. No help was coming, not today, not tomorrow. The forest loomed like a wall, thick and unwelcoming. Strange noises echoed through it, snarls, rustling leaves, calls that didn't sound like any animal he had ever heard. Every shadow seemed alive, every flicker in the darkness a potential threat. The man had never felt so small, so fragile. Yet somewhere inside, a tiny spark of determination began to stir. If he was to survive, he would need to learn the island's secrets, face its dangers, and endure the weight of solitude. He didn't yet know how long that ordeal would last. But the fight for life had only just begun. On the third morning, hunger gnawed at his stomach like a wild animal. Thirst burned his throat until every breath was sharp and dry. The wreckage could no longer sustain him. There was nothing left. If he was going to live, he had to step into the unknown. The forest stood before him like a wall of green shadows, thick with vines and towering trees that blocked out the sun. He hesitated at its edge, listening to the growls and calls that drifted from within. But he had no choice. With a piece of twisted metal in hand, his makeshift weapon, he crossed the threshold. The air changed instantly. Inside the jungle, it was heavy, damp, and alive with sound. Birds with wings painted like fire darted through the branches. Insects swarmed in clouds, their hum constant and maddening. He pushed through tangled roots and thorny bushes until sweat drenched his clothes, and his arms were streaked with scratches. Then he found water. A stream trickled through the rocks, clear and cold. He dropped to his knees and drank greedily, the liquid shocking his parched throat. It was the sweetest taste of his life, hope in its purest form. But the island was not kind for long. That same day, as he followed the stream deeper into the jungle, he heard a low growl behind him. Turning slowly, he saw eyes glinting in the undergrowth. The animal stepped forward, something like a wild cat, larger than any he had ever seen, its coat striped, its muscles rippling beneath its skin. The beast watched him, tail flicking, teeth bared. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to back away slowly, gripping the shard of metal tighter. For endless minutes, the animal stalked him, moving when he moved, pausing when he paused. Finally, as though deciding he wasn't worth the effort, it slunk back into the shadows. His knees gave out with relief, but the message was clear. This island was not his to claim. He was trespassing in the territory of predators. That night, he climbed into the hollow of a tree and wedged himself there, too afraid to sleep on the ground. He listened to the symphony of the jungle, the distant howls, the rustle of leaves, the snap of branches. Every sound was a reminder that he was prey. The days that followed became a blur of discovery and terror. He found fruit, bitter but edible, and learned to crack open coconuts for their precious water. He fashioned crude tools from debris and stone, tested plants cautiously, and burned his tongue more than once on poisonous berries. The island was vast, far larger than he imagined. He climbed a ridge one afternoon and saw nothing but green, stretching to the horizon, broken by rivers and distant mountains. It was a world unto itself, wild and untouched, and he was its only human inhabitant. The loneliness settled deeper into him than any hunger or fear. He spoke aloud just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. At times he wondered if he was still alive, or if this island was some strange purgatory. Yet in the darkest hours, when the stars burned above and the ocean whispered beyond the cliffs, a single truth kept him moving. If this place could kill him at any moment, then he had no choice but to fight harder to live. Days turned into weeks, and the island's true nature revealed itself piece by piece. It was not simply a place of beauty, it was a battlefield. Every sunrise brought new challenges, every sunset brought fear. Survival was no longer about luck. It demanded strategy, courage, and an iron will. The first battle was with the elements. Rainstorms came suddenly, pounding the forest with sheets of water that soaked him to the bone and left him shivering. The sun followed with cruel intensity, burning his skin until it blistered. He quickly learned the need for shelter. Using branches, vines, and fragments of the plane's wreckage, he built a crude hut against the side of a large boulder. It was nothing more than sticks lashed together with desperation, but inside it, he could keep the rain off his body and a fire burning through the night. Fire itself was a miracle, born from sparks struck against metal and carefully nurtured with dry leaves. That first flame felt like a friend, a fragile companion that gave light against the suffocating darkness. Food was the next war. The fruit and coconuts were never enough. His body grew lean, his stomach constantly hollow. He fashioned a spear from a sharpened branch, practicing thrusts against tree trunks until his arms ached. His first attempt at fishing was a disaster. He slipped on wet rocks, cut his foot, and went hungry that night. But failure was its own teacher. Within days, he caught his first fish, small and bony, yet it tasted like triumph. Animals, however, remained his greatest threat. One evening, while gathering wood near the edge of the forest, he heard the low rumble of growls. Out of the shadows came a pack of creatures wolf-like, with long snouts and eyes that glowed in the firelight. He dropped the wood and retreated slowly, gripping his spear. The beasts circled, testing him, their breath steaming in the cool night air. Heart pounding, he thrust the spear forward and shouted, voice echoing through the trees. Whether from surprise or disinterest, the animals eventually slunk back into the jungle, leaving him trembling but alive. Each encounter carved lessons into his memory. Never leave food exposed, always climb higher ground when resting, and never ignore the sounds of the forest. Danger announced itself if one learned how to listen. Yet survival was not only about fighting the island's threats, it was also about fighting the enemy within, loneliness. With no one to speak to, his mind became restless, creating phantoms out of shadows and voices from the wind. At times he thought he saw people moving through the trees, passengers from the flight smiling and calling his name. But when he stumbled forward, there was only emptiness. These hallucinations frightened him more than the beasts. They reminded him that survival was not just about keeping his body alive, but also about protecting his sanity. Still, every small victory kept him going. Every meal, every safe night by the fire, every scar earned from a narrow escape, it was proof he could outlast the island. And with each passing day, his body grew tougher, his instincts sharper. The man who had once boarded a plane as just another passenger was becoming something else entirely. A survivor, forged by the wilderness. But the island had more trials waiting, storms greater than rain, beasts more cunning than hunger, and the endless march of time. He had no idea yet that his battle would last not weeks or months, but more than 700 days. Time became his greatest enemy. Days bled into nights, nights into weeks, weeks into months. What had once been the calendar of a civilized man, meetings, seasons, birthdays, was stripped away. On the island, time was measured only by the rising sun, the hunger in his belly, and the scars on his body. At first, he tried to keep track. He scratched marks into the wall of his shelter, counting each day as it passed. But after 100 lines, the effort felt meaningless. The marks only reminded him of how long he had been alone, how far he was from rescue. Still, he forced himself to endure, because stopping meant surrendering to despair. His body transformed. Clothes shredded by wind and rain were replaced by makeshift coverings, woven from bark and vines. His once soft hands grew calloused, his muscles lean and hardened from climbing trees, carrying wood and fighting to survive. His face, once clean-shaven, now bore a wild beard that reached his chest. When he caught glimpses of himself in still pools of water, he sometimes didn't recognize the man staring back. The routines he built became his lifeline. Each morning he checked the traps he had set along the stream, sometimes catching fish or small creatures. He foraged for fruit when the season allowed, climbed trees for coconuts, and searched for edible roots. By midday he repaired his shelter, sharpened his weapons, or prepared firewood. At night he sat by the fire, carving shapes into wood just to keep his mind from slipping into the abyss of silence. But solitude was a torment unlike any hunger. He craved a voice, a touch, even the simplest conversation. At times he spoke aloud to himself, arguing, laughing, or weeping at words no one else could hear. He invented companions, faces in the flames, friends in the shadows. They kept him sane, or perhaps proved he was slowly losing that sanity. Seasons changed. Monsoon rains flooded his shelter, forcing him to climb into the trees for days at a time. Dry spells cracked the earth, making fresh water scarce. Hurricanes roared in from the ocean, tearing down everything he had built and nearly carrying him into the sea. Each disaster demanded he start over, rebuild, and adapt. Predators never stopped testing him. One night, a massive boar crashed into his camp, overturning his fire and scattering his supplies. He fought with a spear, driving it into the beast's side until it finally collapsed. That kill gave him meat enough to last weeks, but it also gave him a scar across his thigh that never fully healed. Another time, he woke to find a snake coiled above his head in the rafters of his shelter, its tongue flickering inches from his face. He froze, heart pounding, until it slid away into the darkness. The island was merciless, yet it also became a strange kind of teacher. He learned the stars above him, tracing constellations night after night, dreaming of navigation. He discovered which plants healed wounds and which brought sickness. He learned to predict storms by the way the birds fell silent, to follow animal trails to hidden springs, and to sense danger in the stillness of the jungle. Days turned into years. By the time he had counted roughly 700 days, he no longer feared the island the way he once had. He respected it, as one respects a powerful enemy. It had broken him down, reshaped him, and forced him to survive against impossible odds. But though his body had adapted, his heart never gave up hope. Each morning he climbed a ridge and stared at the endless horizon, waiting for the miracle of a ship. Most days there was nothing but water and sky. Still he watched. Still he believed. And one day, after 723 endless days of struggle, that miracle finally appeared. It was late afternoon, the sun sinking low and painting the ocean gold when he saw it. At first, he thought it was another illusion. His tired eyes had often tricked him, turning distant clouds into sails. But this time it was real. A ship far on the horizon, its hull glinting in the fading light. His heart pounded as if it might burst. For nearly 2 years he had dreamed of this very sight, imagined it 1,000 times, prayed for it under countless stars. Now it was there. But the ship was far, too far. Without a signal it would pass, leaving him once again in silence. Frantically he searched his camp. His fire had burned low, but he had something better. A shard of broken glass from the wreckage, polished smooth by months of handling. He climbed the ridge where the sun hit hardest and angled the glass, sending sharp flashes of light across the water. Over and over he shifted it, signaling desperately. His hands trembled, his breath ragged. For long minutes nothing happened. The ship kept moving, steady and indifferent. His hope faltered. He screamed at the ocean, a raw, broken sound. Then he saw movement. The ship had slowed. Through the distance he spotted figures pointing toward the island. Tears blurred his vision as he waved his arms, shouting until his voice gave out. The ship turned, inch by inch, growing larger as it approached the coast. When he finally saw the small boat lowering into the water, carrying men toward him, he collapsed to his knees. His body shook, not from fear but from overwhelming relief. The rescuers reached him quickly, eyes wide at the sight of the wild, bearded figure before them. To them, he must have looked more like a castaway from another century than a man who had boarded a flight from New York just 2 years earlier. They asked his name and he struggled to speak, his voice hoarse from disuse. But the words finally came, "I'm alive." When the ship brought him back to civilization, news spread quickly. The world had long ago written him off as dead, another soul lost in a plane crash over the Atlantic. For his family, his return was more than a miracle. It was resurrection. They embraced him with tears and disbelief, touching his face as if to prove he wasn't a ghost. The man who returned was not the same as the one who had boarded that flight in 1970. He carried the island within him, the scars, the lessons, the unshakable memory of solitude and survival. He knew he would never forget the nights of terror, the endless days of hunger, the constant battle with despair. But he also knew that he had faced the impossible and endured. For 723 days, the island had tried to break him, and for 723 days, he refused to let it. His story became one not just of survival, but of the resilience of the human spirit, the proof that even when cast into the loneliest, most dangerous corners of the earth, hope can be the fire that keeps a man alive.